I've had this hat box for about 20 years now and I love it, but it just doesn't fit my aesthetic anymore. So we are going to upgrade it today using some recycled decoupage paper. I'm going to start by painting it out white. You guys, even though I'm using a darker design today, I still paint out white so that the lighter elements of my decoupage paper will still pop. I'm using the Roycycled Together We Create decoupage paper. I have not done an industrial design for a while, and I am really loving all the elements in this specific design. I decide first what's going to go on the top of the hat box and then go around the edges and rub down so that there is a mark left on my paper. This makes it really easy when I go to trim my paper to cut it out. So that I can cut it down to size. I'm cutting it about 1/8 of an inch larger than what I need, so I don't have to fight with all the extra paper, and also it helps to really reduce any tension that I may have as I decoupage. Today I'm going to be using a water-based sealer to decoupage. This is Wise Owl's varnish, and I'm going to get down kind of an anchor row first. This anchor row really helps to establish how my paper is going to lay on my piece and helps to make sure that it doesn't like skew as I work my way across the piece. I mist my paper first so that the fibers will expand and then they won't expand again when they come into contact with my decoupage medium, which means I'm less likely to have any wrinkles. I repeat this process across my surface until I get this decoupage down. I want you guys to notice that when I'm offloading my brush, I always offload away from my paper first, and then I go back and put more decoupage medium close to the paper. That way I don't end up with a glob of product right under the paper, and I don't end up with a line where it shows exactly where I started and stopped my decoupaging. I work my way from one side to the other, pushing out any air bubbles as I go so I don't have any bubbles or wrinkles under my decoupage paper. I'm being really careful, of course, because this is still wet tissue paper, but because it's an 18-pound tissue paper, which is much heavier than napkins and heavier than the 10-pound tissue paper that you get when you buy paper for gifts, it is more durable and I can manipulate it. Once I get it decoupaged, I go right over the top with my varnish to protect my surface so that my piece lasts over time. Once I get everything dried, I can go in and trim this piece using a sanding block. This is a 180 sanding block that I'm using. Note that I'm only sanding down as I work my way around my piece. This is a really good way to cleanly trim your decoupage and you end up with a nice clean edge. Now that I have this all trimmed, the top is pretty much done. I'm going to come back to the lid, but I want to start working on the body of the hat box. So this one's all painted out white. I believe I did like 2 coats of chalk style paint over the top of this. And now to decide what we're going to actually decoupage onto the bottom. I want the Together We Create to show, and I want to make sure that it shows even when there's a lid on the box. So I position my paper to decide exactly where I want to put it, and then I go over and do the same thing. I just rub on the edge of the box, scoring the paper so that I know exactly where to trim. When I trim, I really do try to leave at least amount of paper or extra paper as possible. So that I do not have to deal with a lot of tension, but I do want to leave a little bit just in case, right? We don't just a margin of error for myself. I'm going to be blending this. This piece is not going to be enough to cover the entire bottom, and I'm going to be blending it with other pieces of paper. So one of the things that I do when I'm going to be blending my decoupage paper is I like to create an irregular edge, so a deckled edge. I'm using my paintbrush. I'm simply dipping it in some water, and I'm painting a line right over the top of my tissue paper. And then when I go to pull the paper, it's actually going to pull and tear right along the line that I painted with the water. Now we're ready to decoupage our piece, you guys. I am already in love with this hat box, and we haven't even finished yet. Once I get it situated on my box exactly the way I want it, I am going to go ahead and on this one, I'm misting my paper first. This is a larger piece, and so it's taking a little bit more effort for me to maintain control over the piece and my paper. So misting my paper first allows me to really lay down that anchor row first exactly the way I want it. Just like before, we're going to repeat the same thing over and over until we get the entire box covered. This paper, I know I made this paper, but I really do love this design so much. This green is so pretty, and it's perfect alongside the orange of the brick. This has all of the yummy industrial bits that I personally love. There are gears and bricks, and there's tons of visual texture. I love this paper so much. There's even some graffiti on here. This paper really is basically an industrial masterboard, because I can certainly use it like I'm using it today by just using whole pieces of it. I could use an entire piece on a piece of furniture, definitely, but there's all these lovely bits that I could cut out and use on smaller projects. You guys can see that I trimmed my paper a little short, so I have a little white showing, but we're not going to worry because I'm going to be blending this paper with paint anyways. You guys, Wise Owl's Botanical is the perfect green for this design. I was so happy. I barely had to adjust this color at all. Next, I'm going to fussy cut some gears because I'm going to float them on the back of my box. And this small piece I'll do in one spot. And then I also have some larger gears on this design, and I'm going to fussy cut those out as well. And I will use these, leaving white in between, because we're going to go in with some texture and blend all these pieces together. Someone asked me what fussy cutting was, and I had a hard time describing it, but basically it's being really meticulous when you're cutting out details. So you'll note that I went around every gear, tooth one by one, using my fussy cutting scissors, which I love so much. These are so much easier on my hands than regular scissors. Once I get my gears all cut, I can go ahead and attach them to my box. Again, I'm using a clear water-based varnish to both adhere and seal my decoupage paper. I chose to use my scissors to cut these pieces out because I don't mind the sharp edges. If the profile of these gears pops out of my texture, that's fine, because these are really industrial looking elements. And seeing the gear teeth is not going to distract from the design. If anything, it's actually going to enhance it. Once I get all of my gears attached, now I can move on to adding some paint to my project to kind of bring everything together. But first, I'm going to take a moment to just sand off this extra paper before we move forward with the rest of the project. Today I'm going to be using Wise Owl's Botanical, which is this gorgeous green, along with Salt Wash. I'm mixing my salt wash and my paint roughly 50-50. I want my final texture to be a lot like drop biscuits. So thickening your paint like this allows you to create a lot of beautiful textures. The thickened paint will leave marks from your brushes or from anything else that you use to create texture. So what do y'all think so far? I hope you guys are enjoying the tutorial. If you love my teaching style and the information that I give, check out my decoupage masterclass below. I go over so many things about decoupage. Whether you're a beginner or you've been doing it for a while and you're looking to level up, I have something for you. If you would like to learn more about creating textured finishes, be sure and log on to roycycledacademy.com and take a look at my textured mastery class. You guys, we go over so many ways to create yummy texture for your projects. Now that I have my paint all mixed, I'm going to start applying it to my surface. You'll notice that I'm dabbing my brush up and down. This is called stippling. So I'm stippling on my paint, and every time I lift up my brush, it leaves tiny peaks on my surface. This texture is going to be so yummy. If you're working on a project and your decoupage isn't large enough to cover the entire surface, using texture is a really cool way to make your project gorgeous, but it's also an easy way to conceal the edges of your paper if you don't want your edges to show. I'm going to pull the texture also onto the paper so that it just incorporates the paper a little bit more. If I only have texture where there's no paper, it kind of makes it obvious where the paper starts and where it ends. And so pulling that texture into your paper just helps to disguise that even more. See that little white area that we left? Easy peasy. I just added a little bit of texture on here, and I think it's so cool that there are green drips in the paper. That makes it look super intentional. I debated on whether or not I was going to paint the top on the sides or if I was going to decoupage it, and I've decided that I'm going to decoupage it. So I am going to use this bit here with a lot of gears right under the area on the top of my box that also has a lot of gears to make it just look more to have more continuity in this project. Now, I am using 2 sheets of decoupage paper for this overall project. I could have used just the 1 sheet, but because I wanted specific elements to line up in, specific places, I did end up using 2 sheets of the Roycycled Create Together decoupage paper. Now I'm going to be blending 2 pieces of paper when I cover the lip of the lid. So I deckled my edges because it makes it a lot easier to blend. And again, you guys, I'm going to try to match up these gears as much as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect, but if I can get it pretty close, it's going to be bomb, right? So I figure out exactly how I'm going to lay my paper. And as always, I'm going to run my finger along the edge of the lid so that it creates a crease in my paper, and I'll know exactly where I need to trim in order to continue. Once I get my paper trimmed, I can use this on the lid, and no worries about the pieces I'm setting aside. I will be using those later for another project. Now, I'm being super specific where I want this paper to lie. So you guys will notice my left hand is gripping that paper for dear life. So I'm going to spritz it first before laying down my anchor row and getting my paper laid down so that it anchors the direction of the paper and I don't have to worry about it tilting or, ending up laying down weird as I wrap around the lid. So I am going to continue decoupaging this all the way around. One thing I want you guys to note is when I'm using the spritzing method, which is when I'm spritzing my paper to pre-stretch it, I always use more decoupage medium. So I'm being really generous with the amount of decoupage medium I'm sitting on my surface. The reason for this is the paper is full of water, and so it's not going to absorb the sealer as readily. So a little bit extra ensures that I really get good adherence with my paper on my surface. So when I'm working on this round box, you guys, I am taking time to dry my sections before I move on to the next section, so I don't have to worry about my paper like sticking to my table or getting stuck on something and pulling off the ink. This process I'm doing right here, you guys, is I'm using the water and the brush, and I'm essentially painting it right along the line of where the other paper ends so that I get a pretty good matchup on my edges. This is a super great process to use, especially with really light papers, where you can literally overlap them, draw one line, and tear each sheet and end up with something that's almost like a perfect match. Once I get my paper all ready, I can go ahead and get the rest of my lid decoupaged, the same way that you guys have seen me like decoupage the rest of this project. Now you guys will notice here that the places where I match the paper up are barely noticeable, especially around the gears. It just looks like a continuous sheet of decoupage paper. Now that my texture medium that I put on earlier is dry, I can move on to my next step. So I'm not trying to copy the paper exactly, but I do want this to all look like it belongs on one project, right? So I'm going to try to emulate some of the color variations that I'm seeing on my decoupage paper. I'm going to be doing a lot of dry brushing over this texture, and so I'm using an oval brush. I love using an oval brush when I'm doing dry brushing because I feel like it's easier to conceal the edges of my dry brushed areas. When I use a square brush, I feel like it leaves a really hard line that is easier to detect. Before I move on to dry brushing, however, I'm looking at these areas that are really light and we have a lot of kind of really organic shapes. So I'm just going to go over my texture and create some random organic shapes, not really to emulate this, but just to kind of pull those colors and that visual texture over to the portion that I painted. When I'm ready to dry brush, I'm going to wipe off most of the paint on my brush and then go in and dry brush. I love being able to dry brush over texture. It's such a beautiful way to deposit additional colors. You guys will notice that you can see the white that I've deposited, but you can still see the green underneath. And so using texture and dry brushing and using different colors is a beautiful way to add depth to your projects. I love when my brush is like almost dry and I can go in and be a little aggressive with my dry brushing. And it's also a really good way to feather out the edges of any dry brush areas that you've done prior to your brush getting to this point. Now, on other parts of this paper, there are really dark green. And so I am going to take the botanical that I've been using and add some black so that I can deepen or darken my color. One of the things I noticed when I was mixing my colors is that the black is really neutralizing my green or making it look more dull. And the dark green on my paper is really bright or really chromatic. And so in order for me to kind of emulate that brightness or saturation of color, I'm going to need to go in with another deep color that's going to allow me to make my green darker without making it duller. So I am just going to use or shift my color by using a little bit of a really dark blue acrylic paint into my paint. I'm being really cautious. I don't want to put too much of the blue because I don't want my green to be teal, but the blue is really dark, so it's going to continue to shift my paint to make it darker, but it's also going to help me maintain some of that brightness or saturation of my color. If you find that you struggle with either coming up with color ideas, deciding on what colors to use, or ways that you can, mix your colors to get the exact result that you want, be sure and check out my crafting and color course at roycycledacademy.com. It is specifically for crafters and those in our niche who love creating things. Learning how color works and how you can use it can be a huge tool for you to have in your toolbox to help you get the exact results that you want when you're creating your fabulous projects. And again, you guys know I got to go in with some dry brushing. So just wiped off the majority of the paint off my brush and just go in and deposit some of that dark color throughout my piece. And you guys can see that even though I'm depositing that dark green, you still see the white and you still see the light green underneath. So a lot of times people want to create textured finishes and they get frustrated because they feel like they can't create it, but it's really about taking your time and layering on different techniques one after the other in order to create finishes like these that have a lot of depth, as if you're almost looking into them, right? So I'm taking this dark color and just going around my edges because y'all know I love a good halo. I cannot even help myself. Another tip to keep in mind when you're creating layered finishes like this is it's super important that you take the time to dry your layers. If I were to continue to deposit more paint over wet paint, I wouldn't be creating separate layers. I would actually just be mixing the paint that's on my surface with the new paint that I'm depositing. And that's how a lot of times when you're trying to create something that's layered, you end up with something that looks super muddy. Another really important tip is to seal between layers. By sealing this, I'm going to lock in what I've already done before I move forward to create or to apply additional layers. And so really drying and separating those layers with your clear coat go a long way to help you create a finish that instead of having one muddy layer, you're actually creating multiple layers and creating beautiful depth. I just love the way the green drips look like they're coming right off of that green on the ledge of this piece. Now, before I move on to my next addition, I am going to make sure and dry my clear coat so that it stays put when I go over it with my next layer. The reason that it's super important also that I seal this layer is because I'm working with both chalk style paint and salt wash. Both are like super porous. So if I go over this with like a layer of glaze like I'm going to do, without sealing it first, the surface would absorb the pigment right away, and I would lose control over my finish and how I want it to look. By sealing it, I get a lot more flexibility in my ability to make slight adjustments if I want to remove some of that, because it's not going to be absorbed by the previous layer. It's actually going to be sitting on top of the clear coat. I want to imitate that beautiful kind of layered look that you see on the paper, where you have something going on in the background and then you have color in the foreground. So I'm going to mix the botanical with some of the water-based glaze, and I'm going to go right over my last layer. This way I'm creating something that is transparent, meaning I'm depositing additional color, but you can still see through this layer to the layer that's underneath. And so that's what I'm hoping to accomplish by going over with this glaze. And again, all I did was mix my chalk style paint with my water-based sealer. Now you guys will see me using a dry brush. And so all I'm doing is if I lay down my glaze and I feel like I've deposited too much of the pigment, I can just use my dry brush to pick up that additional pigment and reveal what's underneath it. So this is the kind of control I'm able to have because I took the time to both seal and to dry my sealer before I went over with my glaze. And that's it. What do you guys think? I did ultimately go and add more white, which I'm probably going to go and put another glaze of green over that, but I'm pretty happy with the result. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Be sure and check out the information on my masterclass below, or you can check out Roycycled Academy for other courses I teach. Otherwise, you can find me on all the places: Facebook, TikTok, Pinterest, Instagram, YouTube. all at Roycycled. Thank you so much. You guys, remember, there isn't anything that I've taught today that you cannot absolutely do. You can do this, and you can do it today. Bye.